This is Jeanne Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine. Thank you for watching Conditions and Constraints, Pathway Builder Guidance and Instructions. We'll break down this topic into 4 parts, a reminder about the levels of expression of a pathway. We'll take a look at pathway component conditions, then how to add conditions and how to add constraints to your pathway. When you are building your pathway, you have 3 levels of expression to consider. The first level, level 1, requires having pathway components and connectors. And remember, the connectors are arrows that connect from left to right to a destination component. So when you're building a pathway, that is the minimum level of expression that you will use. You do not have to include conditions. You do not have to include constraints. But conditions and constraints can be very useful information to people that need to know how to progress through your pathway. So let's take a look at the addition of component conditions, which is level 2, and adding a condition for a level 2 in its simplest form identifies requirements for quantities of resources that have to be completed to meet the condition. And level 3 would be using a component condition and adding constraints to that condition. So a component condition can be used without constraints, but a constraint is really just a part of a component condition, and you'll see what that looks like when I show you the screenshots from the Pathway Builder. And constraints add additional constraints to the condition to complete a pathway. And for example, you may want to indicate a number of credits earned must be equal or greater to than a specific quantity, or maybe courses must be at a certain level, or a number of hours worked must meet a predetermined threshold. So these are all just some examples, and there are many, many more types of constraints and conditions, of course, that could be applicable to your pathways. So by using these 3 levels of expression, you can create dynamic CTDL pathways that more precisely reflect the desired progression and requirement for completing them. So a component condition does 3 things, and it has 2 requirements. First, the component condition provides a way to describe conditions for progressing along a pathway. The condition description, however, is optional, but it is very useful information. And over here, you can see a screenshot of a component condition modal window that's used for editing and creating your conditions, and there is a description here. The core reason, though, for having a component condition is to identify required target components and conditions using a quantity. And what that means is, to the left of a condition, you will have cards that have some kind of requirements that relate directly to the condition. And you're going to identify how many of those cards have to be completed to meet that condition. So in the case where you don't have to put you don't want to use a quantity, you can also use a 0. So in this example, the condition requires completing 3 cards to the left of the condition. But if you wanted to just have a description and you didn't want to include a quantity, you could always put a 0 here. And the third thing that a condition does, it supports including constraints. So when you open up your condition card and you look at your edit modal, you'll also see that you can add constraints to that condition. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So to add conditions, you will always go to your component library in the left rail. You will look for the condition card that is orange, so it's pretty easy to spot. And you drag and drop that onto your board. Once you drag and drop it onto your board, you need to click the 3 little dots in the top right-hand corner to open it up and to fill in the required fields on your card. And you can see here in this screenshot, this pathway has 3 cards to the left of it. So these are pathway components to the left of it: a job, a course, and a competency. And the condition for this example is that the person is required to complete all three of these requirements that are described here in this description to progress through the pathway. And below it, you can see the option to add constraints. You do not have to add constraints. So after you add your condition, you're always going to want to save your condition. So let's talk about constraints. As I said, constraints are always appended to condition components. So when you drag a condition card onto the board and you open it up, you'll fill in your condition, and then you have the option to add constraints. And constraints always require the following, and the condition can have one or more constraints. So you can have one constraint, or you could have several constraints. It's really up to you when you're designing your pathway to define what the conditions are and what the constraints are. But if you are going to add constraints, you will be including what's called a left source, a comparator, and a right source. And we can think about it grammatically as a sentence. So the left source, or the left parameter of a constraint, is equal to the right source, or the right-hand parameter. So we see here, comparators are a defined list that include the following: equal to, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, or not equal to. So the thing being described on the left is always going to be first when you're reading this grammatically, then the comparator, and then followed by the right source. So here's an example. A left source could be a grade. The comparator could be greater than or equal to average, or whatever scoring or grading you use would be the right source. So this is just meant as an example. And then over here, we see a card with the left source, a passing grade, comparator greater than or equal to, and right source filled in. And that's all we have to do to meet that minimum requirement. And we could save it. And you can also see here that if you want to, you could add a name to your constraint and a description. And again, always encourage more information than less information to help people understand the requirements for a pathway. And of course, save your constraint. So to add the constraints, if you want to add constraints to conditions, select that option from the card. So here we're just seeing that we dragged our card on the board, we opened our card, we filled in the condition, and then we went ahead and entered the constraint. And then after we add the constraint, take a look over here on the right so you could see what it looks like, again, grammatically, based on what you entered. So here in this particular card, the constraints are job experience and management experience must be greater than or equal to 6 months. Course grade requirement, the course must be greater than or equal to C. And leadership competency evaluation must be greater than or equal to acceptable. So this particular condition has 3 constraints appended to it. So a little bit more about constraints. We also have, you've noticed on the constraint section of the card, spaces for left action and right action. Well, left action and right action are applicable when you have entered more than one left source or more than one right source. So it may sound a little confusing, but it's actually pretty simple. If you were going to have more than one left source, say with this passing grade here, then you would use a left action. If you're going to have more than one right source, then you're going to have a right action. And you can see that actually here I have an example where there's more than one right source. But let's take a look first at what you'll find if you have more than one left source or more than one right source. In that case, you would be using the drop down, and you would find, again, another defined vocabulary. And it's pretty straightforward. It's either all of, any of, count distinct, maximum, mean, minimum, one of, or some. So for this example here, I have two right sources, average and determined as passing by instructor. And you can see that I selected any of. So the person can progress through the pathway with a grade of average, or if it's determined as passing by the instructor. So any of those. So you pick whatever defined vocabulary is most relevant to the multiples that you fill in your left source or your right source. So if you're going to use a constraint, you're always going to have at least one. If it makes sense for your particular pathway to have more than one left source and right source, you can. That's completely up to you. But if you do, then you will also identify the related left and or right action, and it will come from one of this controlled vocabulary that you see here. And that is how to add conditions and constraints. Additional resources are available through the Credential Engine Pathway Builder Tool webpage. And this video, along with all of these instructions and guidance materials that you see here, are always available through the Pathway Builder in the header from the help. And thanks again for watching.